Okay, welcome to Living in the Path, a series of teachings taught by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. The current module that I'll be talking about is called Abandon Stretching the Legs. So in this module, Lama Zopa Rinpoche encourages us to abandon stretching the legs, or in other words, to abandon laziness, and to stop putting off our practice, and to really strive to attain complete enlightenment, not just for ourselves, but for the welfare of all beings. So Rinpoche uses a verse in this module that says, abandon stretching the legs, give up entering samsara. Vajrasattva, the great king, urges us again and again. So Rinpoche actually is covering the whole path to enlightenment in this 4-line verse. So first of all, abandon stretching the legs. Give up entering samsara. So here, normally for most of us, we spend most of our time, most of our lives, caught up in the pursuit of samsaric pleasures, in worldly success, in gaining recognition, money, possessions, a nice home, good food, entertainment, etc. And we don't find very much time to practice the Dharma. And this is because we don't truly understand the nature of samsara. We think that these samsaric pleasures are going to bring us really true, real happiness. But in fact, according to the Dharma, they will never bring us lasting happiness. They will never bring us real happiness because they're in the nature of suffering. So in this module, Rinpoche helps us understand how samsara is in the nature of suffering and how we will never find what we really want by pursuing samsaric pleasures. So I want to back up a little bit and talk about what samsara is. So samsara, as Rinpoche talks about in this module, is the part of the continuity of the contaminated aggregates caused by karma and delusions. The part of the continuity of the contaminated aggregates caused by karma and delusions. So another way of saying this is that we're reborn over and over and over again in samsara, in this state of suffering due to not being in control, due to instead being under the control of karma and delusions. So we suffer over and over again because we're still under the control of karma and delusions, and we circle in samsara. We are reborn over and over again because of this. So when the Buddha first became enlightened, the initial teaching he gave was the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. The truth of suffering, the truth of the origin or cause of suffering, the truth of cessation, and the truth of the path. The truth of suffering, the truth of origin or cause of suffering, the truth of cessation, and the truth of the path. So the truth of suffering is what is describing the nature of samsara, how all of samsaric existence is in the nature of suffering, that we have to be reborn, age, get sick, and die over and over again, that we have to lose everything over and over again, to lose all that we love, all the people and all the things that we love over and over again, that we have to die without control, that we have to be reborn without control. Samsara is pervaded by the 3 types of suffering which Rinpoche talks about in this module. Mainly he talks about the 2nd and 3rd type of suffering. But the 3 types of suffering are the suffering of change, and pervasive compounded suffering. The suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and pervasive compounded suffering. So we all agree that the suffering of suffering, right, the headaches and the knee pain and the depression and the anxiety are sufferings, right? They're painful, they're grossly painful. And those all comprise the suffering of suffering. So Rinpoche doesn't talk about the suffering of suffering in this module. But he talks a lot more about the second and third types of suffering, which we don't actually understand are suffering. The suffering of change is what we normally consider as pleasure. The pleasure of eating a delicious meal, the pleasure of sitting out in the sun when we're cold. But Rinpoche describes how these pleasures that we consider happiness are in fact sufferings. That if it was a true happiness, then the more we experienced it, the more happiness we would have. For example, if we generate love in our hearts, the more love we have, the more love we develop, the happier we become. But samsaric pleasures are not like this. A good meal, the more we eat, there's a certain point where the suffering of suffering starts, that it becomes more and more uncomfortable. Similarly with sitting out in the sun, it becomes more and more unpleasant the longer we stay in the sun. So all of these samsaric pleasures are in fact not happiness, but they're actually in the nature of suffering. So Rinpoche talks about this a lot more within this module. Then there's the third type of suffering, the pervasive compounded suffering. And this is the most subtle level of suffering. It's the body and mind that we have that's in the nature of suffering, and it's taken under the force of karma and delusions. So our existence, our samsaric existence, is always under the control of karma and delusions, and gross suffering is always possible. All right, so that's the first noble truth, that samsara is in the nature of suffering, and that as long as we're in samsara, we can't escape suffering. Then the second noble truth is the origin of suffering, or the cause of suffering. So the cause of suffering and the origin of suffering are karma and delusions. That all of our gross sufferings, our headaches, people mistreating us, poverty, problems at work are due to negative karma that we've created in the past. And all of this negative karma that we've created under the force of a delusion, right? So we only create negative karma when our minds are under the control of attachment, anger, jealousy, self-importance, puffed up pride, etc. So negative karma is only created because we have delusions. And we only have delusions because of a fundamental misunderstanding. We believe that things exist in a concrete, solid, self-existent way, that they actually don't. So the self, as well as all the phenomena, we believe exist in this inherent, real way. The third noble truth is the truth of cessation. So this is saying that suffering can be stopped, and it can be stopped forever by getting out of samsara. And the fourth noble truth is the truth of the path. So this is the path out of suffering. This is the path out of samsara. We can get out of samsara by cutting the root cause of samsara, which is this fundamental misunderstanding, this fundamental ignorance. And also encompassed in this true path are the three higher trainings, ethics, concentration, and wisdom, as well as the entire Lam Rim, the three principal aspects of the path: renunciation, bodhicitta, and the correct view of emptiness. Right? So these are the four noble truths that help us understand that samsara is in the nature of suffering, that we will never find lasting happiness in samsara, and there is a path out. Then finally, Rinpoche encourages us then to strive to get out of samsara, to stop putting off our practice, to actually put effort into getting out of samsara, and not just for ourselves alone, but for the welfare of all beings. Because actually, all of our happiness is dependent on others. All of our happiness and our good circumstances are dependent on others, our food, our clothing, our homes, etc., our parents. And then Rinpoche also talks about how our enlightenment is dependent on others. So we can only attain enlightenment because we develop bodhicitta. We can only develop bodhicitta in dependence on developing great compassion. We only develop great compassion in dependence on suffering sentient beings. So we can only attain the state of lasting happiness because of the kindness of every single sentient being. So Rinpoche encourages us to strive to relieve the suffering of all sentient beings. They've fallen into this ocean of endless suffering, and it's up to us to help them. So we strive to attain complete enlightenment in order to benefit all sentient beings. This is bodhicitta. So, in summary, Rinpoche urges us to stop stretching our legs, to stop indulging in laziness, to stop our endless pursuit of samsaric pleasures, and to strive to get out of samsara, not only for ourselves, but for all sentient beings, in order to free all beings from this ocean of samsara, to free all sentient beings from this ocean of endless suffering.